Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
My mother invited me to her holiday brunch with the kind of careful emphasis she saves for things she thinks will look noble on paper, and when I walked in, said hello to the relatives who never call unless they need a signature or a ride, and sat down pretending this was just another awkward family gathering where we all perform the same old parts. I did not expect the moment to land quite the way it did, because when she cleared her throat and tapped her glass like she was the chair of a board I never asked to join, she announced that she had updated her estate plan and that everyone seated there would receive something meaningful when she was gone, except me, because I had always been the one who did not appreciate the value of family gifts. And she paused just long enough for every eye in the room to lock onto me like I was a cautionary tale and not a person, and in that exact beat I felt the old heat crawl up my neck, the one I used to mistake for shame when I was younger. Only, this time, instead of letting it choke me, I made my face do the one thing she hates most in the world, which is to stay calm and smile. I wish I could tell you I stood up and gave a speech that made people clap, but the truth is more ordinary and, for me, more honest, because I took a breath that tasted like every holiday I ever sat through and said, in a voice that even surprised me with how steady it was, that it was okay, that she was allowed to do whatever she wanted with her money, that I did not come for a reading of anything, and that I hoped everyone got exactly what they wanted. Then I picked up my water, nodded to my aunt who has made a sport out of watching me fail, and asked someone to pass the rolls like the conversation had moved on, and if you could have seen the way the room flinched, you would understand why I decided right then that no performance could beat the power of choosing not to bleed on command. What I did not do was argue, because arguing is oxygen to people who need an audience, and I was done playing the part where I beg for air while she counts down the seconds, so I let the cousins whisper. Let my brother look at his plate like maybe it might tell him what to think. Let my mother bask in the silence she took for victory. And I excused myself to the restroom with the same politeness I learned as a kid when I had to separate from a table before I said something that would get me grounded, and in the hallway I did something very simple that felt like the first clean breath I have taken in a long time, which was to ask the manager to bring me the entire bill when it was ready and to put it on my card without announcing it. And to please add a generous tip because none of this mess was the staff's fault, and he looked at me like he had seen this kind of theater before and said he could take care of it quietly, which is exactly what I wanted, because I was not there to humiliate her back. I was there to end a game I never agreed to play. I went back to the table and watched the conversation try to find its footing, and I could feel my mother scanning me for a crack, the way she has always done, like she could find a switch under my skin that turns me into the version of me that performs her script. And all I gave her was a steady nod and a little smile that said I heard her and I am choosing calm, and when my brother asked if I was okay, which is the sentence you say when you know you should have said something else during the moment and you did not, I told him I was good, that I had plans later, that I was grateful to see everyone, and I meant it, because if there is one thing I have learned in the years since I stopped asking for permission to breathe, it is that you can leave a room without getting up from your seat. By the time dessert came out, people had relaxed into the relief of pretending we were back to normal, and my mother made a round of little comments about who deserved what and how it was only fair, and I listened without swallowing any of it, because I no longer needed her to be someone else in order for me to be okay. And then the manager approached the table with that quiet confidence people have when they are about to deliver a message on your behalf, and he thanked my mother for hosting, and then turned to me with the receipt folder and said, very simply, that everything had been taken care of and that the gratuity had already been included, and I will not pretend I did not enjoy the way the room jerked like someone had pulled a cord, because the look on my mother's face went from pleased to puzzled to the kind of tight smile you practice in mirrors when you do not want to scream, and I could feel the attention swing back to me like a door that had just remembered which way it should open. I did not make a speech or look for applause, because I have nothing to prove to people who measured my worth with a yardstick I stopped buying a long time ago. So I just said that it felt right to contribute to a family tradition and that I was happy to celebrate the season with everyone, and I lifted my glass and wished them health and peace, and if there was sarcasm tucked under the word peace I think I earned it. Because the point was not to show off, the point was to make it very clear. that I do not need what she holds over anyone's head, and when my aunt tried to joke that this was a bold move for someone who had just been cut out, I looked at her with the kind of patience you save for people who never ask real questions, and I told her that being cut out of someone's will is not the same as being cut out of your own life. Afterward, people floated toward their coats and their gossip, and I gave my mother a hug that did not last longer than it needed to, and she said in my ear that I did not have to do that, and I said in hers that neither did she. And we both smiled like polite strangers, and that was the last honest moment we had all day, because the truth is she wanted me to beg, and I wanted her to understand that the begging part of my life is over. And if she could not hear it in my words, she could certainly see it in the receipt she did not get to sign, which, for her, is the only kind of sentence that ever really lands. On the way out, my brother caught up to me in the parking lot and asked if I was angry, and I told him I was not angry in the way I used to be, that I was done renting a room in my head to someone else's story about me. And he nodded like maybe he understood, and then he said something small and honest about how she had been talking a lot lately about changing beneficiaries and trusts and whatnot. And that little sentence slid into place like a puzzle piece I had been holding for years, because it told me she was not just making an announcement, she was laying a trap, and I smiled again and told him I had my own plans, which was true, because earlier that morning, before I walked into that brunch, I had already moved my first piece on the board. And by the time anyone at that table figured out what that meant, it would be too late to stop it. If you have ever grown up in a house where praise is a coupon you can never quite redeem and help is a spotlight aimed only at the chosen people, you understand how easily a kid learns to smile through a stomach full of gravel. And when I look back at the long chain of little moments that led to that brunch, I can see the pattern as clearly as if someone had sketched it on a whiteboard, because there was the time my brother forgot a deadline and my mother drove across town to hand-deliver his forms and call it dedication, and there was the time I won something small but earned by effort, and she said it was nice that I had found a hobby, and there were 100 versions of the same play where I was the reliable background noise, and he was the headline act. Which means I learned early that asking for fairness in that house was like dropping coins into a machine that only plays music for other people. By the time I was old enough to make my own choices, I had already been given my role, which meant I was asked to drive people to appointments and take calls when someone needed a professional-sounding voice to clean up a mess, and then reminded that I was too independent when I did not show up for the jobs that existed only because someone else had not done theirs, and in those years I tried what most people try, which is to reason with the person who holds the keys, only to discover that reason is a language my mother speaks fluently until it requires her to open a door for me, after which she suddenly forgets the words. So when I needed help once, nothing dramatic, just a small safety net to bridge a gap I had already mapped and priced and planned. She told me that learning to live within my limits would be good for my character, and I nodded like you nod when you realize the teacher is grading from a rubric you will never see. What I did instead was start treating my life like a business even before I had a business, which sounds colder than it was, because what I mean is that I began tracking what worked, cutting what did not, and refusing to sink emotion into wells that only gave back dust. And while my mother told a tidy story about me being stubborn, I was quietly building habits that put a floor under my feet that no one else could pull out, and the longer I did that, the clearer it became that her power did not come from her wallet so much as from the idea that she could open it or close it while everyone watched, which is why the brunch stunt landed like theater for the relatives and like an old rerun for me. Because I had already decided years ago that my worth would never again be held hostage by a check I had to applaud for. People hear fortune and think glamour, but what I built looked more like discipline than sparkle, more like long hours than applause, and while my mother laughed at the choices I made and called my work a phase I would outgrow, the phase kept paying bills and then paid bigger bills and then paid ahead, so that by the time she began floating rumors about beneficiaries and trusts and who should be taken care of, I had already taken care of the one person I was sure she would never prioritize, which was me. And I do not say that to sound heroic. I say it because survival gets louder once you stop trying to make it look pretty for people who will never clap for it. So when my brother caught me in the parking lot after the brunch and asked if I was angry, and then let slip that our mother had been talking a lot about the rules that come with her kindness and who deserved to be on the list, I heard what he was not brave enough yet to admit, which was that he was already being managed with money, and I remembered too many conversations where he had complained about a loan that would not go away and a car payment that kept him on a leash. And I made a choice in that moment that I knew would not look like revenge to anyone outside the family, but would feel like a small explosion inside it, because nothing rattles a person who trades favors for loyalty like watching the merchandise walk off the shelf. I called him the next day and told him I wanted the truth without the family filter, and after the usual back and forth where he tried to protect our mother's image while also asking for help without saying the words, he admitted that a predatory loan had been chewing through his paychecks and that he had agreed to let our mother help in ways that would keep the screws tight, and I told him I could either step in properly or not at all. No shaming, no lectures, no fine print. And he went quiet the way people do when they are not sure if the trap is different this time or just dressed better, and then he said yes, not with excitement, but with the tired relief of someone who has been holding a door shut with their hands and finally hears a deadbolt click. I spent the afternoon doing the work my mother calls luck when other people benefit from it and calls disrespect when I do it for myself, which means I pulled names, found the right owner of the debt instead of the noisy collector, negotiated a payoff that stopped the bleeding, and filed the documentation in a way that sent future calls to nowhere. And I did it with his consent and his information and his full knowledge so that nothing could later be spun as theft of responsibility or meddling. And when the confirmation landed, I sent him a short message that said the calls would stop by Tuesday and that the next payment would not be drafted. And then I told him something I knew would bother our mother more than anything I could buy, which was that he owed me nothing and that I expected nothing, that my only request was that he stop letting money be the leash she uses when she wants his silence. He called back an hour later sounding like a person who had just realized his phone could ring without making his stomach hurt, and I let him talk and cry a little and make jokes to cover the crying. And I kept my voice steady and kind because there is nothing to be gained by humiliating someone who has been taught to mistake control for care, and when we hung up I sat there with the simple quiet that comes after you cut one of the ropes holding a tent in place. Because that is what this has always been, a tent built out of control and expectation and the promise of gifts that arrive with strings, and I had just cut one, not with a dramatic speech or a grand reveal, but with a clean transaction and a refusal to take anything in return. It was not loud and it was not flashy, but it was the first move that made the ground shift, because my mother did not know yet that the debt she had used as leverage no longer existed. And she would only find out when the old lines failed to pull and the old threats lost their bite, and I will admit it gave me a fierce kind of satisfaction to imagine her tugging on a rope that now led nowhere. Because if she wanted to play chess with inheritances and loyalty, I had just taken a night off her. Bored without raising my voice, and as I closed my laptop that night I understood that this was only the first thread I was going to pull, and the next one would be closer to the center of her web than she could possibly imagine. When people talk about luck, they like to make it sound like a lightning strike that just happens to you one afternoon while you are walking across the street, but in my case luck was really just the accumulation of years where I was forced to figure things out without backup. Years where the safety net I kept hoping for never arrived, and where the people who were supposed to offer support acted like withholding it was a way to build my character, and while it felt brutal when I was young, it turned into the exact reason I eventually built something on my own that no one in that dining room could have imagined. I learned very early to live on less than I earned, to take opportunities that did not look glamorous at first, but that held potential, and to treat every setback not as a confirmation of failure, but as a kind of free education that nobody else was going to hand me, and that mindset, as unromantic as it sounds, is what allowed me to start stacking bricks of independence long before anyone thought I had the tools to build anything at all. When I was in my 20s, my mother would sigh whenever I talked about work, as if I was rehearsing lines from a play that would close in a week, Because in her mind, stability meant a paycheck from an institution she could point to with pride when neighbors asked what her children were doing, not the inconsistent earnings I was piecing together from contracts, side projects, and the occasional risk that most people thought was reckless. But I knew that the only way to escape the leash was to take those chances. I took extra shifts when nobody wanted them. I lived in apartments that other people said were beneath me. And I poured every extra dollar into ideas that looked boring to anyone who needed immediate validation, but that quietly grew into something much stronger. There was no applause in those years, only silence and the occasional mocking comment at Thanksgiving about how I must like struggling, and yet every time she dismissed me, I was learning another skill, building another contact, or adding one more notch to the ladder that I would later climb without asking her permission. The real turning point came when I started a small service business that had almost no overhead and could be run with just a laptop and a phone, something my mother waved away as a phase, telling anyone who would listen that I was trying out a hobby. But that so-called hobby started pulling in enough money to cover my rent and then my bills, and then, almost suddenly, more than I had ever expected. I reinvested instead of showing off, which meant that while my siblings flaunted what they bought with the checks she occasionally wrote for them, I kept my head down, added to my reserves, and turned those reserves into real investments. It was not glamorous, and it certainly did not look like wealth at the time, but year after year those investments grew, and by the time my mother began boasting about who she was going to take care of in her will, I already had accounts she did not know existed, assets she could not trace, and a security that meant her threats had become background noise rather than shackles. Nobody in my family ever asked how I was paying for things because they did not want to believe there was a story that did not include my mother's generosity, and that is why the brunch was so satisfying for me. Not because I wanted revenge in the loud sense of embarrassing her, but because I knew with complete certainty that while she was dangling money like a weapon in front of my siblings and cousins, I was already past the point where I needed or even wanted anything she might one day write into a line of her will. The freedom of knowing you cannot be bought is indescribable, because once you step into that position you see just how desperate everyone else looks when they are still tethered to the illusion that they need her approval to survive. What they do not know is that the small business I started, the one they called a distraction, was only the first door, because that door opened to partnerships and investments that multiplied quietly while they were busy waiting for her checks to clear. I put money into places they would not have understood even if I had explained, and because I had no safety net, I did the research myself, I learned the systems myself, and I took every mistake as tuition rather than tragedy. And the result was that by my mid-30s I was no longer playing the same game. I was the one paying cash for things they financed. I was the one who could walk away from a bad deal without worrying it would sink me. And I was the one who had the kind of quiet independence that does not make headlines, but does let you sleep at night without waiting for a call that someone else is pulling the plug. That is the part my mother has never understood and likely never will, because for her money has always been theater, a stage where she could decide who got the spotlight and who had to stand in the shadows. But for me, money has always been structure. The floor under my feet, the proof that I can stand without her stage. I never told her what I had because silence was more powerful than bragging, and I never corrected her when she implied that I was just scraping by. Because every time she did it, she was digging herself deeper into a version of the story that would eventually collapse in front of her. She thought she was the only one holding the cards, but she did not even know I was playing with a whole different deck. So when she made that announcement at the brunch, when she told a room full of people that I would be getting nothing, I was not crushed and I was not even surprised. I was amused because she thought the threat still worked. And she had no idea that the only person truly dependent in that room was her, because once the illusion of control breaks, the power goes with it. I left that brunch smiling not because I was unaffected, but because I knew something the rest of them did not. I had already built my own fortune, and nothing she signed on a line could take that away. What remained was simply the decision of how and when to let that truth surface, and I had no intention of rushing it, because sometimes the most devastating revenge is not a public announcement. It is the quiet reality that when the curtain falls, you are the only one standing on solid ground. Once the brunch was behind us and the shock of my calm reaction had faded into whispers and retellings that traveled faster than any official announcement ever could, I started to notice something that gave me a kind of satisfaction I had never experienced before, because while I had not shouted, argued, or tried to reclaim my dignity at the table, the silence I left behind had started to work like a slow but unstoppable current that pulled every one of them into deeper waters than they were prepared for. My mother assumed I would shrink after her declaration, that I would find myself excluded, embarrassed, and isolated. Yet the opposite happened, because the more I refused to give her the reaction she expected, the more others began to wonder how it was possible that I was not begging, not pleading, not fighting for a share of what she believed was her final weapon. It started with little things, the kind of details people dismiss until they cannot anymore, like when I paid off my brother's debt and he stopped taking her calls with the same obedience he once had. Or when I replaced my old car with something reliable without asking anyone for advice or assistance, and suddenly the cousins who had smirked at brunch began asking cautious questions about how I managed it. Not because they were happy for me, but because they could not reconcile the story my mother had been spinning for years with the evidence in front of them. It was almost comical to watch them try to disguise curiosity as casual conversation, as if asking me how I was getting by would hide the envy under their tone, but I did not rush to explain anything, because I had already learned that the less I said, the louder the cracks in their version of reality would sound. My mother, of course, noticed the shift long before anyone admitted it, because control was her oxygen, and when she sensed it thinning, she scrambled for ways to tighten her grip. She started inviting me to talk things through over coffee, framing it as reconciliation, but lacing it with pointed remarks about how families are built on transparency and loyalty, which was her way of fishing for information about how I was maintaining myself without her handouts. I never gave her what she wanted. I listened politely, nodded when necessary, and reminded her that I was fine, that I appreciated her concern, and that I had no expectations. The more I stayed calm, the more unsettled she became, because it was dawning on her that for the first time in her life she could not buy or bully her way into controlling me. And the truth is that realization hurt her more than any harsh words I could have ever thrown back in her face. The more she tried to maintain her authority, the more obvious it became to the others that something was unraveling. My sister, who had spent her life carefully orbiting close enough to our mother to receive benefits, but far enough to avoid direct conflict, began asking why I seemed so at ease when the rest of them were competing for approval like contestants in a rigged show. I told her the truth in the simplest way possible, that I had stopped treating our mother's money as oxygen, and that once you do that, you realize how pathetic it is to fight for scraps when you could build your own meal. She laughed awkwardly and dismissed it as stubbornness, but I saw the unease flicker in her eyes, because deep down she knew she had built nothing of her own, and that everything she leaned on could be taken away with one bitter decision. That fear is exactly what my mother relied on, and by refusing to share it, I was no longer inside her circle of control. The irony is that my silence became the loudest act of defiance. When bills arrived, I paid them without comment. When vacations were planned, I joined or declined without needing a subsidy. When arguments broke out about who deserved what, I excused myself without explanation. Every time I refused to participate in the performance, I made it clear that the script no longer applied to me, and the audience began noticing that the play was falling apart. My cousins started to resent the fact that my mother still held them hostage with vague promises about inheritances, and whispers about fairness grew louder. Not because they suddenly cared about justice, but because they began to realize that I had quietly opted out of the competition while they were still fighting for medals that meant nothing outside the arena. The tension reached a point where even family friends who had been present at the brunch began making comments, little half-jokes about how I seemed to be the one person unfazed by the announcement, and each time I heard it I felt the weight of years lifting off me. Because it proved that my mother's public humiliation had backfired. Instead of branding me as the undeserving child, she had spotlighted me as the one who no longer needed her, and that subtle difference eroded her power in ways she had not calculated. She wanted me to beg. Instead, she created a narrative where people quietly wondered what I had that gave me such calm, and suspicion is a poison she could not control once it entered the system. I will not pretend I did not enjoy watching it unfold, because every uncomfortable glance at gatherings, every whispered speculation, every failed attempt she made to reassert her authority reminded me that I had already won without ever declaring war. My revenge was not loud or dramatic. It was the quiet reality that I was free, and they were not, and nothing exposed that more clearly than my refusal to play along with the same old games. And as I watched the family grow more restless under her thumb, I knew it was only a matter of time before her empire of control cracked open for good, because when loyalty is built on nothing but the promise of money, all it takes is one person walking away to show everyone else that the promise was never worth what it cost them. By the time she realized the inheritance no longer terrified me, it was already too late, because the power she had clung to had shifted, and she could not understand how it had happened without her permission. I did not tell her that the moment she stood up at that brunch and declared I would receive nothing, she had actually handed me everything I needed, the proof that I was free. What she did not yet realize, but soon would, was that her attempt to control the family with money had planted seeds of chaos that I would never need to water, because greed and resentment were going to do the work for me. And all I had to do was stand back and let them grow. By the time the holiday season had passed and the gossip from that infamous brunch had made its way through the family like smoke you cannot keep contained in one room, the cracks that had begun to show in my mother's carefully managed image had widened into full fractures. And what once looked like unquestionable authority had started to resemble desperation dressed up as control, because even though she still spoke with the same clipped tone and carried herself with the same sense of self-appointed importance, the truth was that everyone could see her words no longer carried the weight they used to. My siblings had begun snapping at each other over imagined slights. My cousins were competing not for her affection, but for evidence of what she had promised each of them privately. And the entire structure that had always been held together by her dangling the possibility of financial reward was unraveling in real time, not because I had exposed her directly, but because I had refused to play along and, in doing so, had shown them all that the leash could actually be cut. The beauty of the situation was that I did not have to orchestrate their implosion with dramatic speeches or threats, because once suspicion takes root in people who are already motivated by greed, it grows all on its own. And I was free to stand back and let the harvest come in. My brother, the one who had once been her golden child, now carried himself with a kind of nervous independence, because he no longer needed her checks to keep his head above water. And every time he ignored one of her calls or delayed responding to her demands, it chipped away at the image she had worked so hard to project. My sister, who had spent her life perfecting the art of staying in my mother's good graces, had begun quietly complaining to friends that our mother was becoming impossible, and once those words left her mouth they could never be taken back. Because for people like my mother the worst betrayal is not outright rebellion, but the subtle admission that her grip is slipping. I cannot deny that I took a certain private joy in knowing that the most devastating revenge I could deliver did not involve destroying her assets or exposing her secrets, but rather in making her realize that she no longer had power over me, and that without that power she was nothing more than another aging parent with children who had learned to live without her. Every time she tried to remind the family of what she could provide, I let the silence hang a little longer. I let the awkward glances circle the room, and I let her feel the emptiness that comes when an audience is no longer convinced by the performance. She had always believed that money was her ultimate weapon, but I had already built a life where her money was irrelevant, and once that truth became visible, even in small ways, she lost the only real advantage she had ever held. The final move, though, came not from me making some grand reveal, but from me choosing the precise moment to show her that all the threats, all the humiliations, and all the manipulations had only built the conditions for her own downfall. When she tried once more to stage a gathering, this time framed as a discussion about clarifying her legacy, I attended without drama, greeted people with the same calm politeness, and listened as she attempted to reassert control by outlining what each person would supposedly receive and what conditions would be attached. But when she came to me, expecting to twist the knife again, I interrupted her for the first time in my adult life, not with anger, but with a steady tone that cut sharper than any outburst could. And I told her that she did not need to include me in her calculations because I had no interest in any of it, that my life was already secure, and that the only legacy she had left me was the lesson that survival tastes better when it is earned without strings. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I had ever experienced at one of those gatherings, because everyone understood in that moment that I had just removed myself from her game permanently. And the shock on her face told me that she had finally realized there was no way back, no bargain she could offer, no leverage she could twist. I did not need her wealth, I did not fear her judgment, and I did not even crave her approval anymore, which meant she had lost me completely, and in losing me she had also lost the illusion of control she used to hold over the entire family. I stood, thanked her for the invitation, wished the others well, and walked out without waiting for permission, without looking back, and without feeling even a trace of the guilt that used to weigh me down every time I left her presence. What happened afterward was exactly what I knew would happen. The rest of them turned on each other, the fights grew uglier, and the promises she had dangled like treasures became weapons that tore apart the family she had always claimed to be protecting. I did not have to lift a finger to make it happen. I simply had to refuse to participate, and the rest crumbled under the pressure of their own desperation. By the time the dust settled, my mother was left with a fractured family, suspicious children, and a reputation that no longer commanded obedience, while I had something none of them could take away: the freedom to live my life on my own terms, with my own fortune, and with the peace of knowing that I had turned every wound she gave me into strength. And so, when people ask me why I smiled at that brunch instead of fighting, why I accepted her public announcement so calmly, the answer is simple. I knew even then that her words had no power, that she could only cut me off from something I had already chosen to outgrow, and that my silence would become the loudest response she had ever heard. My mother thought she was punishing me when she declared I would get nothing, but the truth is that she handed me my victory in that moment, because by making it public she forced everyone to see what I had already known for years, that I had built a life without her. And that was the one inheritance she could never take away.